January 17, 1938. Northrop Corporation, El Segundo, California. The morning air tasted of salt and engine oil. Beyond the hangar doors, the Pacific stretched endlessly toward a horizon where empires were stirring. Inside, beneath the skeletal framework of an experimental aircraft, Chief Designer Ed Heinemann stood with a slide rule in one hand and a crumpled telegram in the other. The Navy's message was blunt. America possessed no dedicated dive bomber capable of striking enemy warships with precision. In a world hurtling toward mechanized war, the United States Navy, guardian of two oceans, had nothing that could plunge through flak and cloud to deliver a bomb directly onto a carrier's flight deck. The telegram carried weight beyond its words. Across the Pacific, Japan's carrier strike force was rehearsing coordinated attacks with a precision that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. In Europe, the Luftwaffe's Junkers Ju-87 Stuka was perfecting the terrifying art of the near-vertical dive, its inverted gull wings and screaming sirens becoming symbols of blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, American naval aviation relied on converted biplane torpedo bombers, rugged, brave, and hopelessly inadequate for the war that was coming. The dive bomber, that peculiar marriage of aircraft and artillery, remained a theoretical concept in American arsenals, a gap in capability that would be catastrophic if left unfilled. Heinemann knew what the admirals would not say aloud. Time was collapsing. The world was not sliding toward war. It was already there, just beyond the horizon, gathering like a Pacific typhoon, and when it arrived, control of the seas would be determined not by the tonnage of battleships, but by the aircraft that could find and kill carriers before they launched their own strikes. The nation that mastered the dive bomber would master the carrier war. The nation that failed would watch its flat tops burn. The aircraft taking shape in that California hangar carried the designation XBT-2. It was Northrop's answer to a problem most Americans did not yet know existed. Sleek where other designs were brutish, it abandoned the fixed landing gear that had defined carrier aircraft for a retractable system that promised speed. Its wings were perforated with dive brakes, slotted flaps that would allow the aircraft to plunge at near-terminal velocity without tearing itself apart. Everything about its design suggested aggression, precision, the application of force at a single decisive point. But it was still only a prototype, one design among many, competing for attention in a Navy bureaucracy that moved with the speed of peacetime procurement. What Heinemann and his team could not have known, standing in that hangar as 1938 began its slow march toward 1939, was that their prototype would evolve into the weapon system that would break the back of Japanese naval aviation. They could not have known that within 4 years, this aircraft, refined, militarized, and christened the SBD Dauntless, would plunge through smoke and steel above a thin strip of coral called Midway, and in the span of 5 minutes would alter the trajectory of the Pacific War so completely that historians would mark it as the hinge upon which the entire conflict turned. But in January 1938, there was only the work, the slide rule, the telegram, and the question that would define the next 4 years. Could American industry, starting from nearly nothing, produce a dive bomber capable of matching and exceeding the weapons being perfected by potential enemies who had a decade's head start? The dive bomber was born from a simple geometric truth. The closer an aircraft could release its ordnance to the target, the more likely it was to hit. Horizontal bombing from altitude, the preferred method of the 1920s and early 1930s, was an exercise in statistical probability. A bombardier might drop his payload from 10,000 feet, watch the bombs tumble away, and hope that wind, drift, and human calculation aligned perfectly. Against a stationary ground target, this was difficult. Against a warship maneuvering at 30 knots, it was nearly impossible. Pre-war studies indicated that horizontal bombers achieved hit rates below 2% against moving naval targets. 2%. In any future naval war, that was a prescription for defeat. The dive bombing technique inverted this equation. By pointing the aircraft's nose directly at the target and diving at angles approaching 70 degrees, the pilot transformed his entire aircraft into a gun sight. Gravity and velocity aligned. The bomb, released at low altitude with minimal horizontal drift, had nowhere to go but down. Hit rates in pre-war exercises climbed to 20, 30, even 40%, astronomical compared to horizontal bombing. But the technique demanded aircraft capable of enduring forces that would rip conventional designs apart. It demanded pilots willing to push their aircraft into screaming dives, to hold steady through flak that exploded close enough to feel, to release their ordnance at altitudes so low that the blast from their own bombs could damage the aircraft. By 1938, Germany and Japan had embraced dive bombing as doctrine. The Stuka had become the Luftwaffe's precision instrument, capable of destroying bridges, bunkers, and ships with an accuracy that shocked observers during the Spanish Civil War. Japan's Aichi D3A, though still in development, represented the culmination of years of tactical experimentation. Both nations understood that in modern war, precision mattered more than tonnage. Better to deliver one bomb exactly where it would do the most damage than to scatter dozens across empty ocean. America, by contrast, had debated the concept endlessly and built almost nothing. The reasons were institutional, cultural, and strategic. The Army Air Corps, dominated by bomber advocates who believed in high-altitude strategic bombardment, showed little interest in an attack profile that required diving toward the Earth. The Navy, more pragmatic, recognized the need but lacked the industrial partnerships to produce a purpose-built design. Various manufacturers had submitted proposals throughout the 1930s, biplanes mostly, carrying inadequate bomb loads, and lacking the structural strength for repeated combat dives. None had progressed beyond limited production. The gap was not merely technological. It was conceptual. American military aviation in the late 1930s was still emerging from the shadow of Billy Mitchell's theories: strategic bombing, destruction of industrial capacity, the belief that wars would be won by fleets of bombers striking deep into enemy territory. The dive bomber, by contrast, was a tactical weapon, a tool for naval surface warfare, designed to kill ships rather than factories. It required a different kind of thinking, a willingness to accept that future wars might be decided not by grand strategic campaigns, but by precise applications of force at sea, by pilots who could find an enemy carrier, push through its defenses, and put a 1,000-pound bomb directly through its flight deck. This was the context into which Douglas Aircraft, having absorbed Northrop's design team in 1937, introduced the SBD. The initials stood for Scout Bomber Douglas, a designation that captured the aircraft's dual role. It would scout ahead of the fleet, searching for enemy forces across hundreds of miles of ocean, and when it found them, it would transform into a precision weapon capable of delivering destruction with surgical accuracy. Jack Northrop's original design had provided the foundation: the perforated dive brakes, the retractable landing gear, the long-range fuel capacity. Douglas refined it, militarized it, strengthened the airframe to handle the repeated stress of combat operations. By late 1940, the first production models were rolling off assembly lines and into Navy squadrons. The pilots who would fly it into combat were still training, still learning the peculiar rhythm of the dive bombing attack. The roll-in, the plunge, the breathless seconds of holding the target steady in the bomb sight, while the altimeter unwound and flak burst close enough to taste. They were mastering a technique that demanded absolute nerve, that left no room for hesitation. Pull out too early and the bomb would miss. Hold too long and the aircraft would not recover from the dive, would simply continue its plunge into the ocean or the target itself. Every successful dive bombing attack was a negotiation with physics and fear. What none of them knew, in those peacetime training flights over the California coast, was that they were preparing for a morning in June 1942 when their skills would be tested against the most experienced carrier striking force the world had ever assembled. They could not have known that the SBD Dauntless, an aircraft born from bureaucratic necessity and rushed into production with barely 2 years of refinement, would prove to be exactly the weapon needed for a battle that would last 5 minutes and change everything. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The SBD Dauntless pilots of the Enterprise Air Group were airborne when the war began. Their carrier had been delayed returning to Pearl, and so they approached Oahu that Sunday morning expecting to land, refuel, and stand down for shore leave. Instead, they flew into smoke. The harbor below them was burning. Battleships listed in the shallows, their hulls torn open by torpedoes and bombs. Hangars across Ford Island erupted in secondary explosions, and mixed among the smoke were aircraft bearing the red circle of the rising sun, pulling out of their attack runs, racing back toward carriers that had launched them from positions north of the island. Some of the SBD pilots tried to land. Others, seeing the chaos, diverted to auxiliary fields. Several were shot down by trigger-happy American anti-aircraft gunners, who could no longer distinguish friend from enemy in the smoke and confusion. The Dauntless, on its first day of war, was blooded not in a coordinated strike, but in confusion and desperation. Its pilots, trained for precision attacks against enemy carriers, instead found themselves witnesses to catastrophe, unable to strike back because they could not find the enemy fleet that had delivered this blow, and then vanished beyond the horizon. The psychological impact was profound. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was not merely a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of capability. It showed what a well-trained carrier striking force could accomplish when it achieved surprise. The American battleship fleet, the foundation of Pacific naval strategy for 2 decades, had been rendered irrelevant in a single morning. The future of naval warfare had arrived in a wave of torpedo bombers and high-level bombers and, most devastatingly, dive bombers that had placed their ordnance with a precision that shocked American analysts. Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers had struck hangar complexes, fuel storage, and ships in port with an accuracy that suggested years of training and tactical refinement. The question that consumed American naval leadership in the weeks after Pearl was simple and terrifying. Could American dive bomber pilots match that performance when the opportunity came? The SBD Dauntless was unproven in combat. Its pilots were trained but untested. The tactics were still being refined. Meanwhile, the Japanese carrier fleet, veteran of campaigns in China, hardened by years of exercises and doctrine development, was rampaging across the Pacific with apparent invincibility. In the first months of 1942, Japanese carrier strikes supported invasions of the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. They raided into the Indian Ocean, sinking British warships. They struck at Darwin, Australia. Everywhere they went, the story was the same. Japanese aircraft appeared, delivered devastating attacks, and withdrew before Allied forces could mount effective responses. The SBD's first real test came in February 1942, during raids on Japanese positions in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. These were pinprick attacks, designed more to boost American morale than to inflict serious damage. But they provided combat experience. Pilots learned what it felt like to push through anti-aircraft fire, to hold steady as tracers arced past their canopies. They learned the timing of the dive, the peculiar sensation of pulling out at low altitude with the target flashing beneath them, the long flight back to the carrier wondering if their bomb had hit. The results were mixed, some hits, some misses, but enough success to prove that the aircraft and tactics were sound. Then came April 18, 1942, and the Doolittle raid. Army B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet to strike Tokyo itself. Though SBDs were not involved, the raid had profound implications for carrier warfare. It proved that American carriers could operate deep in hostile waters. It demonstrated that Japan's home islands were vulnerable. And most significantly, it prompted a reaction. The Japanese High Command, stung by the psychological blow of bombs falling on their capital, began planning a decisive operation to lure out and destroy the American carrier fleet. They would seize Midway Atoll, an isolated American outpost northwest of Hawaii. The Americans would be forced to respond, and when they did, the combined fleet would annihilate them in a climactic carrier battle that would secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific. The stage was being set for the confrontation that would define the SBD's legacy. But first, there would be the Coral Sea. May 7-8, 1942. Coral Sea. The battle was a confused affair, fought over vast stretches of ocean, with both sides groping for the enemy through clouds and rain squalls. SBD pilots from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown found the Japanese light carrier Shoho on May 7, and sank her in minutes, a small victory, but proof that American dive bombers could kill carriers when they found them. The next day, in a sprawling engagement that saw both sides launching strikes simultaneously, SBDs helped damage the fleet carrier Shokaku, putting her out of action for months. But the cost was severe. The Lexington, struck by torpedoes and bombs, burned uncontrollably and had to be abandoned. The Yorktown was damaged. Both sides withdrew, claiming victory. Both bloodied. What mattered was not who won, but what the battle revealed. For the first time, carrier forces had fought each other without their surface ships ever making contact. The entire engagement was decided by aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters clashing in the sky while their carriers maneuvered beyond visual range. It was the future of naval warfare made manifest. And within that new paradigm, the dive bomber had proven itself essential. The SBD pilots who had struck Shokaku had put bombs directly through her flight deck, rendering her unable to operate aircraft. Precision, not volume of fire, had determined the outcome. The Japanese drew the wrong lessons from Coral Sea. They had turned back the American attempt to support Port Moresby. They had sunk a fleet carrier, and they believed their own forces remained qualitatively superior. The Americans, by contrast, drew the correct lesson. They could fight the Japanese carrier fleet and survive, and given the right circumstances, they could win. The SBD Dauntless, that aircraft which had not existed 4 years earlier, had proven capable of striking at the heart of Japanese naval power. The question was whether it could do so again, under even more desperate circumstances. That question would be answered at Midway. June 4th, 1942. Dawn, northwest of Midway Atoll. The ocean was empty of meaning. Beneath the aircraft of the American strike force, there was only water, endless and indifferent. The pilots of Bombing Squadron 6, Bombing Squadron 3, and Bombing Squadron 8 had launched from Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown in the cold pre-dawn darkness, following their torpedo bombers and fighters toward a reported position of the Japanese carrier fleet. But the Japanese had moved. The ocean where they should have been was vacant. Fuel gauges were dropping. Some squadrons turned back. Others pressed on, gambling on the chance that the enemy was just beyond the horizon. The torpedo bombers found them first. The slow, obsolete TBD Devastators pushed through Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire in a display of courage that bordered on suicidal. They attacked in ones and twos, launching torpedoes that the Japanese carriers dodged with ease. Of the 41 Devastators that attacked that morning, only 6 would return. Their sacrifice accomplished nothing tactically, No hits, no damage. But they pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top height, forcing the Zeros to burn fuel and ammunition defending against the low-altitude torpedo threat. And they forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver wildly, breaking formation, disrupting the carefully choreographed dance of carrier operations high above, arriving by separate routes and through a navigation error that would later seem like divine intervention, came the SBD Dauntlesses. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, had made a gamble. With fuel running low and no carriers at the expected intercept point, he had turned north, following the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer that was racing to rejoin the fleet. That course correction, a decision made in seconds based on instinct and tactical reasoning, brought him exactly where he needed to be. At 10:22 am, McCluskey's dive bombers broke through a gap in the clouds and saw, spread beneath them like pieces on a game board, the carriers of the Kido Butai, the Japanese First Air Fleet. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being prepared for a strike against the American carriers. Fuel lines snaked across the decks. Ordnance carts stood ready with bombs and torpedoes. The carriers were at their most vulnerable, caught in the transition between defense and attack, their decks full of volatile fuel and munitions. McCluskey did not hesitate. He rolled into his attack dive. The SBD pilots had trained for this moment for years, though none of them truly believed it would come in this form. 3 enemy carriers beneath them, flight decks exposed, defenses focused elsewhere. The dive was a controlled fall, a negotiation between gravity and aerodynamics. Push the stick forward. Roll inverted to align with the target. Let the nose drop past the horizon until the carrier filled the bomb sight. Extend the dive brakes, those perforated flaps that Heinemann had designed in a California hangar 4 years ago, and feel the aircraft shudder as drag built up, slowing the dive to a speed where the pilot could maintain control, where the bomb sight remained steady despite the screaming wind and the flak that was now reaching up toward them. At 70 degrees nose down, the world compressed into a tunnel, the carrier ahead, growing larger with each second, the altimeter unwinding with terrifying speed. The stick vibrating in the pilot's hand, the knowledge that at any moment a shell could rip through the cockpit, or the wings could fold, or the dive could simply continue into the ocean because there was no more altitude left to trade for recovery. The SBD pilots held. They held through flak bursts that rocked their aircraft. They held through the physical strain of the dive, the weight pressing them into their seats. They held until the carrier deck filled their entire field of vision, until they could see individual aircraft, individual crew members running across the deck. And then, at the precise moment calculated by training and instinct, they released 1,000 pounds of high explosive, falling free, the pilot hauling back on the stick, pulling out of the dive, the ocean rushing up before the aircraft leveled and clawed for altitude. The sickening pull of multiple Gs, vision graying at the edges, the aircraft groaning under stress it was designed to endure but which still seemed impossible. And then, climbing away, a glance back to see if the bomb had found its mark. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading a section of 3 SBDs from Enterprise, put his 1,000-pound bomb directly into Akagi's flight deck, just aft of the midship elevator. The bomb penetrated into the hangar deck below, where it detonated among the armed and fueled aircraft waiting to launch. Secondary explosions followed immediately. Fuel fires spread. Within minutes, Akagi, flagship of the Kido Butai, veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major Japanese offensive, was a floating inferno. Her flight deck buckled, her interior spaces consumed by fire, fed by her own aviation fuel. Kaga took 3 hits in rapid succession, each bomb striking with the precision that dive bombing was designed to deliver. The explosions triggered catastrophic secondary blasts among the strike aircraft crowded on her deck. Fires merged into a single conflagration that overwhelmed damage control efforts. Within hours, she would be abandoned. Soryu, attacked by dive bombers from Yorktown, suffered 3 direct hits in 3 minutes. Like her sister ships, she carried death on her deck in the form of fueled and armed aircraft. The bombs transformed that ordnance into a weapon against the ship itself. She burned with an intensity that made her uninhabitable within minutes. The attacks lasted 5 minutes. 5 minutes from the first bomb release to the last. In that span, shorter than a television commercial break, 3 veteran Japanese fleet carriers, ships that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had rampaged across the Pacific for 6 months, that represented the peak of Japanese naval aviation, were reduced to burning wrecks. They would all sink within hours or days, taking with them not just their hulls but their experienced aircrew, their trained maintenance personnel, their institutional knowledge of carrier warfare. The Japanese expected to lose aircraft. They expected to take damage. What they did not expect, what their entire operational doctrine had not prepared them for, was the total collapse of their striking power in minutes. Japanese carrier doctrine, refined over years of exercises and combat operations, assumed that battle damage would be gradual, that even wounded carriers could continue operating aircraft, that the redundancy of a 4-carrier striking force would allow them to absorb losses and continue fighting. They had prepared for attrition. They had not prepared for annihilation. The American dive bomber pilots who pulled away from their attacks and formed up for the flight back to their carriers understood they had hit something, but they could not yet comprehend the magnitude. They had trained to attack carriers, to put bombs on target, but the idea that 3 fleet carriers could be eliminated in a single strike seemed beyond possibility. Some pilots, circling to assess damage, saw the fires spreading and wondered if the hits had been lethal or merely damaging. The SBD carried no armor, no heavy defensive armament. Its survival depended on getting in, striking and escaping before the Japanese could mount a coordinated response. The pilots who had attacked that morning had been extraordinarily lucky. The Japanese combat air patrol had been pulled down to the deck by the torpedo bomber attacks. The carriers had been caught at precisely the wrong moment, and the American dive bombers had arrived through breaks in the clouds. That provided concealment until the moment of attack. But luck alone did not account for what happened. The SBD Dauntless, that aircraft rushed into production from a standing start in 1938, had proven itself capable of executing the most demanding mission in naval aviation: the coordinated dive-bombing attack against enemy carriers defended by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Its perforated dive brakes allowed precise control during the attack dive. Its robust airframe absorbed battle damage that would have destroyed more fragile designs. Its range allowed it to search hundreds of miles from its carrier and still return. And most critically, it could deliver its ordnance with an accuracy that transformed theoretical combat doctrine into devastating reality. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, escaped the initial attack and launched a counterstrike against Yorktown, damaging her severely. But later that afternoon, SBD pilots found Hiryu and subjected her to the same treatment her sisters had received. 4 bomb hits in a matter of minutes. The pattern was identical: penetration into the hangar deck, secondary explosions among fueled aircraft, uncontrollable fires. By evening, all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai were dead or dying. The most powerful concentration of naval aviation ever assembled had been broken by an aircraft that had not existed when Japan began its conquests in China. In the aftermath, as historians would dissect the Battle of Midway and elevate it to the status of decisive engagement, the emphasis would often fall on intelligence, the American codebreakers who had provided warning of the Japanese plan, or on leadership, the decisions made by Fletcher and Spruance. These factors mattered, but they were meaningless without the weapon system capable of executing the mission. The most brilliant intelligence and the wisest tactical decisions amounted to nothing if the aircraft attacking the Japanese carriers could not penetrate defenses and deliver bombs with sufficient accuracy to inflict lethal damage. The SBD Dauntless was that weapon system. It was not glamorous in the way that fighters were glamorous, not imposing in the way that battleships were imposing. It was utilitarian, built to a specific tactical requirement, optimized for a mission that demanded precision over raw performance. It would never be the fastest aircraft in the sky or the most heavily armed, but it could dive through flak, hold steady long enough to aim, and put ordnance exactly where it needed to go. That capability, refined over thousands of training hours and perfected in combat, proved to be the decisive factor in the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. The Japanese never recovered from Midway. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced aircrew created a gap in capability that Japan's industrial base could not fill. New carriers were built, new pilots trained, but the institutional knowledge, the veterans who had perfected the tactics of carrier aviation through years of combat, was gone. Japan's subsequent carrier operations in 1942 and 1943 lacked the coordination and lethality that had characterized the Kido Butai in its prime. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built around the concept of the decisive battle, the single engagement that would shatter enemy resistance. At Midway, they got their decisive battle. They lost. For the SBD Dauntless, Midway was validation. It had proven itself under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. In the months and years that followed, SBDs would continue to serve in every major engagement in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea. They would sink more Japanese warships than any other Allied aircraft type. They would serve as scouts, as close air support for marine landings, as anti-submarine patrol aircraft. Later in the war, as newer dive bombers like the Curtiss SBD Helldiver entered service, the SBD would be gradually replaced, but its legacy was secure. The symbolic weight of the SBD's achievement at Midway extended beyond mere tactical success. In a war increasingly defined by industrial production and technological innovation, the Dauntless represented something essential about American capability: the ability to identify a critical need, mobilize industrial and engineering resources, and produce a weapon system that could compete with, and ultimately surpass those developed by adversaries who had years of head start. In 1938, America had no dive bomber. 4 years later, it had the best dive bomber in the world, operated by pilots trained to a level of proficiency that matched or exceeded their Japanese counterparts. This transformation did not happen by accident. It required vision from designers like Ed Heinemann and Jack Northrop, who understood that future naval warfare would demand aircraft capable of precision strikes. It required support from Navy leadership, willing to invest in a weapon system that contradicted the prevailing emphasis on battleships and strategic bombing. It required industrial capacity at Douglas Aircraft to produce thousands of airframes with the quality control necessary for combat operations. And, most critically, it required pilots willing to master a technique that was fundamentally dangerous, that required them to point their aircraft at the earth and trust that training, technology, and nerve would allow them to recover before impact. The German soldiers who had watched Stukas scream down on Polish defenses in 1939 thought they understood dive bombing. The Japanese pilots who had perfected the technique during years of combat in China thought they had mastered it. But neither had faced an opponent who could execute the same tactics with equal skill and superior numbers. The SBD pilots at Midway had demonstrated that American forces could match the tactical proficiency of their adversaries, while benefiting from an industrial base capable of replacing losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. This combination, tactical competence backed by industrial might, would prove to be the formula that won the Pacific War. In the years after the war, veterans of the SBD squadrons would gather at reunions and remember that morning at Midway. They would talk about the dive, about the sensation of pushing through flak, about the moment of release and the desperate pullout that followed. Some would speak of luck, of being in the right place at the right time. Others would emphasize training, the hundreds of practice dives that made the combat mission feel like reflex rather than choice. A few would acknowledge the terror, the knowledge, in the moment of the dive, that survival was uncertain, that the aircraft might not pull out, that the flak might find them, that the mission demanded they fly into danger with no guarantee of return. What none of them needed to say, because it was understood by anyone who had been there, was that they had been part of something larger than individual survival. The attack on June 4, 1942, had been the culmination of years of development, training, and tactical evolution. Every design decision made by Heinemann in that California hangar in 1938 had mattered. Every training flight over the Pacific coast had mattered. Every doctrinal debate about how dive bombers should be employed had mattered. It had all led to 5 minutes that changed the trajectory of the war. The SBD Dauntless never received the public adulation given to fighters like the F-4U Corsair or the P-51 Mustang. It was not featured prominently in wartime propaganda, did not become a symbol of American air power in the way that heavy bombers did. But within the Navy, among those who understood carrier warfare, the Dauntless held a unique place. It was the weapon that had been needed at the critical moment, and it had performed exactly as designed. That was its legacy, not glamour, but effectiveness, not fame, but results. Epilogue, El Segundo, California. 1945. Ed Heinemann stood in the same hangar where the prototype that would become the SBD had taken shape 7 years earlier. The war was over. Production lines were shutting down. The aircraft that had sunk 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, that had supported Marines at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, that had hunted submarines and struck shore installations across the Pacific, was being retired. Newer designs were replacing it, faster, carrying heavier bomb loads, equipped with more advanced systems. But Heinemann knew something that would take historians years to articulate fully. The SBD Dauntless had arrived at exactly the right moment to fill a need that might otherwise have proven catastrophic. If America had entered the Pacific War without a credible dive bomber, the early battles would have been even more disastrous than they were. The carriers that survived Pearl Harbor might have been lost in subsequent engagements, unable to strike back effectively at Japanese forces. The balance of power in the Pacific might have tilted so far toward Japan that recovery would have been impossible. Instead, the SBD had provided a weapon capable of contesting control of the seas, of striking at the enemy's center of gravity, his carriers. It had proven that American industry, starting from almost nothing, could produce weapon systems that matched or exceeded those of adversaries who had been preparing for war far longer. And it had demonstrated that American pilots, given the right aircraft and the right training, could execute complex combat missions with a level of skill that rivaled any force in the world. The dive itself, that peculiar maneuver that defined this SBD's combat method, had become a metaphor for American determination. To push the nose down, to point directly at the target despite flak and fear, to hold steady through the screaming descent, to release at the precise moment, and then to pull out, to survive, to return and do it again. That was the pattern that had won the Pacific War, repeated thousands of times, across millions of square miles of ocean. In military cemeteries from California to Hawaii, from Guadalcanal to the Marianas, lay the pilots who had not pulled out, who had held too long, or had been struck by enemy fire, who had disappeared into the ocean without trace. They had flown an aircraft that demanded absolute commitment, that left little margin for error, that transformed every combat mission into a test of nerve and skill. The SBD Dauntless was unforgiving of mistakes, indifferent to fear, and brutally honest about the costs of war. But it had worked. That was the truth that mattered in the end. When the moment came when 3 Japanese carriers lay beneath the clouds northwest of Midway with their decks crowded with death waiting to happen, the SBD Dauntless and its pilots had been ready. They had executed the mission exactly as designed, exactly as trained. 5 minutes. 4 carriers. The turning point of the Pacific War, an aircraft that had not existed in 1938, had by 1942 become the weapon that broke the back of the most experienced carrier-striking force ever assembled. It had proven that precision, properly applied, could achieve what raw firepower could not. It had shown that the side willing to dive directly at the target, to accept the risks inherent in the attack, to hold steady despite every instinct screaming to pull away, that side would prevail. The perforated dive brakes, the retractable landing gear, the reinforced airframe, the bomb sight calibrated for steep-angle attacks, every technical element of the SBD's design had been vindicated in combat. But the aircraft was only part of the equation. The rest was human, the pilots who had mastered the dive, the maintenance crews who had kept the aircraft flying under impossible conditions, the tacticians who had developed the doctrine that allowed coordinated strikes against defended targets. Together, they had answered the question posed by that Navy telegram in January 1938. Yes, America could build a dive bomber. More than that, America could build the dive bomber that would help win the Pacific War. The SBD Dauntless was not perfect. It was not invincible. But it was precisely what was needed, delivered at precisely the right moment, flown by pilots trained to exploit its capabilities fully. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was the difference between defeat and victory, between Japanese control of the Pacific and American resurgence. It was the proof that industrial democracies, even when starting late, could produce weapons that matched the best their enemies could field. And it was the demonstration that courage, skill, and precision embodied in the howling descent of a dive bomber pushing through flak to strike at an enemy's heart could change the course of history in the span of 5 minutes on a June morning in 1942. The war moved on. New aircraft replaced old. The technology advanced. But the lesson remained, carved into the historical record as deeply as any battle honor or campaign ribbon. When the nation needed a dive bomber that could sink carriers, Douglas had built one. And when those carriers appeared beneath the clouds at Midway, the SBD Dauntless had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had dived, it had struck, and the war had turned.